Live from Singapore, this is Insight with Haslinda Amin, where we dive deeper into the stories that matter with crucial context and sharp analysis. President Trump signals force, promising strikes 10 times harder as the U.S. hits Iran for a second day, raising fresh risks to shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. Asian stocks climb on chip strength and AI demand, even as oil extends gains, keeping geopolitical and inflation risks firmly in play. Nomura's Julia Wang will tell us why she prefers rotating beyond chip stocks, pointing to broader tech and industrial plays tied to AI expansion. India's Narendra Modi is in Australia, pushing defense and energy ties with uranium supply and regional security cooperation high on the agenda. Political strategist Lynton Crosby will join us as Australia and the UK see political landscape shifting with rising support for far-right parties at the cost of traditional conservatives. Our top story today, the U.S. military striking Iran for the second straight day, straining an already fragile ceasefire. The U.S. Central Command says the additional strikes were aimed at preventing Iran from targeting ships in the Strait of Hormuz. It also says the U.S. is holding Iran to account for attacks on commercial shipping in the international waterway. Meanwhile, on the flight back to Washington from the NATO summit in Turkey, Trump told reporters the U.S. stands ready to escalate further.
We just hit them very hard, and I say we hit them 20-1. Every time they hit us, we're going to hit them 20. And we did it last night. They did a little something today, but it was really retribution for last night. They hit actually 3 boats, not 2. And when they hit, we hit back much harder.
Let's get more with our Middle East correspondent, Aber Abu Omar, joining us from Dubai. Aber, the latest strikes casting doubt on the prospects for negotiations.
Yeah, good morning, Haslinda. There were doubts to begin with, even before those attacks. The ceasefire or the negotiations over this MOU for the next 60 days or so have already been a little bit rocky. But then we saw President Trump yesterday making these pretty strong remarks at the NATO summit, calling the Iranians, and I quote him, scum, calling them liars, saying that as far as he's concerned, the ceasefire negotiations are over. But then, Haslinda, it's quite important here to bring on the nuance, the caveats around this. And it's the fact that in his own remarks, President Trump later on said that the negotiators, namely Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, are free to continue the talks if they wanted to. They'll have to come back to him. And so these are not remarks that we haven't seen President Trump make before, albeit a little bit stronger yesterday. But it goes back to this back and forth that President Trump has maintained over the course of the past 3-4 months or so, of saying they will attack Iran, but then saying that the negotiations are going in a strong direction. But what we saw overnight is definitely concerning. We saw Brent prices also climbing on the back of that. Axios reporting earlier that the U.S. had struck railway bridges in the northern part of Iran. So this retaliation by the United States continues, and it's in the aftermath of Iran attacking a ship in the Strait of Hormuz at the beginning of this week. This was a Qatar-flagged LNG-laden ship for not sticking to the route that it had laid out for ships in the Strait of Hormuz. And so we're seeing 2 days of attacks or 2 days of retaliation by the United States. President Trump threatening more escalations. Iran, on the other hand, coming out with its top negotiators and other officials saying that this is not going to work out with bullying. And as far as they're concerned, parts of the ceasefire are rendered ineffective due to the United States actions. And so back and forth, tit-for-tat actions we're seeing yet again in the Middle East, Haslinda, but it's a situation that is fast developing with countries in the GCC up until the early hours of this morning being attacked.
And we're taking a look at Brent, currently above $79 a barrel. Albert, the question still remains about the Strait of Hormuz. Is there freedom of navigation? What happens now?
It's a good question, Haslinda. Look, I mean, the variables are still very much moving for the time being. We're seeing this trickle of movement. And again, even before all of this, our energy colleagues have put out these notes about the fact that the trickle of movement in the Strait of Hormuz is still nowhere near where it was pre-war. And this adds just another layer of complication. Now, what we know about the Strait of Hormuz is the fact that the paradigm has definitely changed for Iran. Iran woke up to the fact after this war that it has and can lay out control over the Strait of Hormuz. So they're holding the waterway as a leverage point in their negotiations with the United States. And the message is quite clear from the Iranian side. Stick to the routes that we've laid out, or the threat of being attacked is very much real. Now, it's not clear how the U.S. would respond to that, or how ships and ship owners would start treading through the waterway. We've already been seeing them treading with a little bit more caution over the past couple of weeks or so, just understanding how they can carry their movement through this waterway, and asking for permission, if you were, from the Iranian side on just exactly what routes to take out. But this is just going to be the new reality going forward with Iran and the United States, Haslinda.
Bloomberg Middle East correspondent Abu Umar, thank you so much for that. Now, markets appear to have lost their earlier momentum, which had given the impression that they were largely unfazed by the latest escalation involving the U.S. and Iran. Crosby and TAIEX now lower, oil prices climbing back above $79 a barrel. Now, in recent days, we've also seen the AI rotation trade gathering pace in the region as traders hunt for cheaper ways to play the tech boom. We're seeing money beginning to rotate into China after investors crowded into South Korea and Taiwan for much of the year. Meanwhile, Singapore's state-owned investor Temasek is ramping up its exposure to artificial intelligence and the Americas. CIO Rohit Sipahimalani told us while segments of the AI trade look frothy, they expect earnings-driven growth to continue near term.
The U.S. obviously has the leading models, and you have all the hyperscalers, etc. In China, along the AI hardware value chain, so whether it's sort of optical interconnects, where they have more than 50% of the world's market share, all feeding into data centers, whether it's into things like on the robotic side, physical AI, robotics, that's an area because of all the manufacturing excellence that and the depth that China has. That's an area we think will do very well out there. So there are different segments of the market you play in both, and frankly, we see opportunities in both which are not necessarily that overlapping. We're obviously playing the hyperscalers in China through companies like Alibaba or Tencent in the public markets, and ByteDance in the private markets. So we have that exposure too. But generally, they're serving very different markets from what the US hyperscalers are serving.
But I guess the question really is, how do you protect yourself from the risk? Because you just don't know when it comes to geopolitics, what issue will come to the fore, what issue will be the hot topic between the US and China.
There are companies who have access to large domestic markets. They have a supply chain, and technology is within one geoeconomic sphere of influence. So I'll give you an example. Like in India, we do a lot in healthcare services and hospitals, right? Now that is not really influenced by geopolitics. In China, we're doing a lot of the domestic consumer brands. That's not influenced by geopolitics. So we shape our portfolio so that a substantial part of it is likely to be less impacted by geopolitics. And to the extent that some are, there we look at it and see what's the size of our exposure, what's the real risk, we try and mitigate it. If there's something that's obviously going to be at the crosshair of geopolitics, we will typically not do it.
And when you take a look at the U.S. market, valuations are at record highs, very stretched, driven pretty much by tech and AI. How do you justify mobilizing your capital without, putting yourself at risk if that AI capex bubble were to pop?
What's interesting is that the entire rise in the market this year, and let's take the US for example, has been all earnings driven. In fact, multiples today are lower than what they were at the beginning of the year. Beginning of the year, they're closer to 22 times. They're probably 20.5 times right now. So actually, multiples have come down. But the US is looking at earnings growth of over 20% this year. It's not just the AI. The S&P equal weight index is expecting earnings to grow at 17% this year. And it's not just the US. Across the world, whether it's the US, Europe, Japan, or EM as a whole, every market is expecting double-digit earnings growth this year and in 27 and in 28. So, and what is driving that? It's all being driven by CapEx, AI is obviously a significant part of that, but it's not just that. It's energy security, it's defense, it's a number of other areas. And typically, CapEx-driven growth cycles are very good for earnings because the people who are recipients of that spend, they take 100% of that spend as revenue. The people who are spending, they account only for the depreciation cost right now. So as a whole, it's actually very good for the earnings thing. Now, at some point, this acceleration CapEx cannot continue indefinitely, and that's why you will have cycles. But at least in the near future, we don't see that changing materially. So it's right now, I would say, a very earnings-driven market. There's segments of the market that are frothy, but the segment I mentioned, the hyperscaler, they're trading at about the lowest multiples that you've seen in the last few years.
What's looking frothy?
One is within AI, if you look at some of the private stuff out there in the early stage, I mean, there's so many deals getting done at 50 times revenues, et cetera. And some of the companies are growing so fast that you justify that because you suddenly, the 50 times revenues becomes 10 times revenues in 2 years. But not everyone's going to get there. So yes, and that's why I'm saying when you're playing in the frothy areas, you got to be confident that that's an area of hyper growth. But secondly, you've got to be sufficiently diversified.
And I'd like to pick up on returns. When you take a look at Sovereign Wealth Fund GIC, its returns has been about 5% over a 10-year period, and its mandate has been pretty conservative. It is in line with how Temasek has done. If you look back over the years, what's gone right for you? What hasn't really gone right?
So if I look at the last 10 or 20 years, our Sing dollar returns have been in the 7% range, 10 years 7.1, 20 years 6.8, and the US dollar returns have been between 7.5% and 8%, which really means doubling your portfolio every 10 years or so, which at the scale we are, I think is reasonably creditable, and it's also broadly in line with our cost of capital. What is equally important, what we actually, I feel better about, is the resilience we've had.
Let's zoom out and talk about the strategy for the future. How are you positioning Temasek for the next 5 to 10 years?
So we know it's going to be an environment of high uncertainty, whether it's sort of AI, it's geopolitics, it's climate, it's inflation, etc. So for us, the most important thing is that we need to have a portfolio that's relatively balanced and resilient across different environments. So at one end, we have a stable part of our portfolio, which is the TPCs in Singapore, which is 40% of the portfolio. Then we're investing in areas like private equity, which we have been doing, but the funds, which are fairly diversified, and these are global diversified funds, which also therefore have relative stability out there. And then we've got the areas where we're looking to increase our exposure to core plus infrastructure and private credit. Again, things that are relatively more stable in volatile environments, and actually also the risks, one of the risks we talk about is inflation. Both these asset classes actually outperform in a higher inflation environment. So that gets you to about 65% or over 65% of our portfolio, which is relatively stable and will do well across different environments.
And that was Temasek International CIO Rohit Sipahimalani. And right now we have several headlines from the U.S. Central Command. According to its post on X, the U.S. has struck about 90 Iranian military targets, and that follows their successful strikes in Iran the night before. We also have a reaction from Iran itself, from Press TV, saying that Iran has launched attacks at U.S. bases in Kuwait as well as in Bahrain. Again, the U.S. forces have struck about 90 Iranian military targets following their successful strikes in Iran the night before. And Iran says it itself has launched attacks at U.S. bases in Kuwait as well as in Bahrain, according to Press TV. Of course, the U.S. military struck Iran for the second straight day to further degrade their ability to threaten freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. It is holding Iran accountable for recent unjustified aggression against commercial shipping as well as civilian crews freely navigating the water. We're seeing reaction in Brent crude right now We have Brent trading at 78.93 as we speak, up about 1%. Let's get perspective from Julia Wang, North Asia CIO at Nomura International Wealth Management. Julia, good to have you with us. First off, your reaction. I mean, we're seeing Brent trading higher. Obviously, sentiment has changed somewhat, right?
Yeah. Yes, definitely. So I think this is another flare-up that just reminds us that this peace deal is fragile, and the negotiation that was supposed to take place over 60-day period, it can be tested repeatedly by things like this. And I guess what we're seeing is Iran and U.S. battling for control over this strait, and I think that obviously push up oil prices, a dense sentiment when it comes to risk asset like equities. At this stage, it's hard to really say whether this means a breakdown of the peace deal that we had, whether that means the base case around the peace deal eventually happening needs to be changed, because we've seen this type of negotiation styles before with U.S.-China trade tensions. Sometimes there's flare-ups, there's attempts to get a better bargaining position midway through the negotiation, and I think that this is also a scenario where we also already expected some kind of flare-up anyways. So it's really hard to say if this changes anything. We have to see if the negotiation will continue at some point in the next coming days to really assess how much of a base case change.
What has changed though is the freedom of navigation at the Strait of Hormuz. It was meant to be open, and now a big question mark, and that's why we're seeing oil prices headed towards $79 a barrel. Oil prices at current levels, does that change the calculus somewhat?
I think not for the near term, in a sense that oil at 70, 80, actually it's not too far from where we were before the war. So in some degree, the fall back in oil price has been the surprising part, how quickly it fell back after the peace deal was signed. But I think what's actually, to your point, what's changed is the fragility of the situation, the probability of other scenarios happening around this base case. And I think from a medium perspective, it absolutely means that energy transition becomes a bigger imperative for anyone who's dependent on fossil fuel. Because you think about this and you think about the contested nature, like you said, of the Strait of Hormuz maybe going forward for the next couple of years, what that means for your energy supply. Why wouldn't you accelerate to diversify your energy sources, to electrify your economy and move forward with other things that are safer? So I think that it increased the imperative for a secular theme that's already, in our view, very well placed to do well from an investment perspective.
Do we then go back to the playbook of AI? Because there's so much more certainty of AI's long-term play.
I think that our clients and us, we believe in AI as a transformative foundational technology. So I think that every sector eventually will be impacted by it one way or another. But as we assess the evolution of this process, I think what we've seen so far this year is that markets differentiate significantly between what part of AI they want to play. And the certainty, the underappreciated potential back in February, March was memory, because we saw huge bumper earnings and the market probably didn't really anticipate it to be that good. So that was the sort of the favorite trade that bucked the macro kind of headwind in February and March. Now we think that that part of the story is relatively well priced. We don't think it's overvalued, but we think it's well priced for the next couple of quarters, unless you're saying something will change for 2028 or beyond, which is possible. So we are looking for maybe more underappreciated angle to play the AI trade, because our investors want us to stay on this future-oriented theme. So, but we have to look for ways that are also profitable.
What's underappreciated right now?
So I think there are actually a lot that's underappreciated. Within tech sector, the divergence has been significant. The hyperscalers really has taken a bidding, both in the US as well as in China. And software has done very badly. I think as we head into the earnings season, a lot of that could actually be up for a reassessment, because maybe we paint everything with too broad a brush. People will say, well, actually this and that company did much better than we expected, or the cloud revenue growth is much faster than we thought. thought. So I think tactically speaking, for the next 1 to 2 months, as we weather this macro uncertainty, this will be the sector within tech that we look very closely. But to stay future-oriented, I think, and to also lower your overall portfolio volatility, we want to look at other extension of the AI play. And we think that investors have underappreciated the importance of power as a real constraint for AI advancement. And this is already catalyzing a lot of change in the way that power is sourced and the way that power stays on the grid and off the grid. And there's a lot of opportunity that also actually coincide with so many other secular themes as well. So we really like the industrial aspect of the equity market, and we think that it could be a much better addition at this point to play the AI trade.
And in terms of geography, it is not just about the US, it's also about Korea. There's been a lot of repricing, reassessment. How are you looking at the attractiveness of the Korean market? Add to that the volatility.
Yeah, I think if you look at the memory aspect, which has been driving the Korean market, we think the price is right because earning growth is really strong. And the market structure won't change anytime next 1 to 2 years. So we have some degree of comfort knowing that certainty, that from an earnings perspective, the competitive advantage there. The market structure is fragile because it's coming on the back of leverage ETF, which lends to the extreme volatility. So I think that limits how much exposure you can have to it, or you have to maybe add other exposures on AI that's less volatility to balance out your overall portfolio. So we think Korean market price is right, but the market infrastructure is volatile. After having been up 100, 200% this year, I think this correction that we saw last 1 to 2 weeks is absolutely healthy to have. If they're down a little bit more, I think investors will actually look at it as a big buying opportunity because they know that earning will stay strong. No doubt about that.
Well, I guess the question really is, how do you hedge against the massive gyrations we've seen in the Korean market?
Yeah, I think the way is to diversification. I think there, as we said, there's many other underappreciated AI opportunities, be it in other segment of tech. Why wouldn't you look at hyperscalers? Just because cloud is a little bit further away from monetization full monetization at this point, doesn't mean that it won't monetize in the next 2 to 3 years. So, extend your investment horizon a little bit and think about hyperscaler. Think about software. Why would all software do badly? Why wouldn't some adapt to technology given time and given the ability to do so, right? Why wouldn't the other tech sectors benefit? So I think just adding beaten down, underloved things that are out of spotlight for the moment is already a very good way to hedge against that more volatile nature of memory stocks.
All right, Julia, we'll have to live with that. Julia Wang, North Asia CIO at Nomura International Wealth Management. Plenty more ahead. Keep it here with us. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back. You're watching Insight. Let's do a check on Asian markets reversing earlier gains on the back of what we heard from the U.S. Central Command, U.S. forces completing an additional round of strikes against Iran. And that's according to the U.S. Central Command. In a post on X, it said it struck about 90 Iranian military targets, including air defense systems, coastal surveillance assets, missile, as well as drone storage sites. We're seeing that reaction in the markets. The MSCI Asia-Pac index now down about 0.2% as oil hedges higher, currently at $78.94 a barrel. New York crude at $74.43. Well, still ahead, we talk UK politics as a re-election gamble by far-right figure Nigel Farage faces competition from novelty candidate Count Binface. We'll assess the state of play with the man who masterminded David Cameron's surprise victory back in 2015, veteran campaign strategist Lynton Crosby. Keep it here with us. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back. You're watching Insight. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi is in Melbourne for talks with his Australian counterpart, Anthony Albanese. The two leaders are expected to sign agreements on defence and energy before attending a public rally. Bloomberg's Asia-Pacific economic reporter Swati Pandey joins us now. Swati, what is on the agenda for Modi in Australia?
Good morning, Has. So Modi is in Melbourne at the moment. He has done one session with CEOs. He has a bilat with Anthony Albanese, and then the two will also do an India-Australia Leaders Summit. There will be joint statements after that, and then Modi heads for the public rally that you mentioned, which is with Indian diaspora. He likes to do that whenever he's traveling overseas, as a way to communicate with Indians abroad.
What really is expected to come out of the talks, Swati? Is this a time when both sides commit to long-term economic architecture beyond China risk hedging?
That's right. The main thing that is expected today is a deal on uranium exports. So Australia will be able to export uranium to India. This has been going on for a very long time, and looks like finally they have been able to iron out some of those differences. They're also going to talk about deepening economic ties and defense as well. Modi has been traveling a little bit. He went to Seychelles last week. He was in Indonesia before this. He's going to New Zealand next, and he's basically trying to bring together the so-called middle powers as there's uncertainty about what the US wants to do in the region, and there's a little bit of suspicion around China's assertiveness as well. So defense is going to be a big topic of discussion, as well as boosting exports and trade relations.
Bloomberg's Asia-Pacific economic reporter Swati Pandey there for us. Now to the UK and far-right figure Nigel Farage's shock decision to quit Parliament and seek re-election. The move was intended as a demonstration of political strength, but it could also backfire on one of the architects of Brexit. Let's bring in economics and government reporter Rebecca Chung-Wilkins. Rebecca, what's the state of play in UK politics right now?
Sure. Well, I mean, we can kick off with Nigel Farage in a really interesting situation now where it seems that he may be fielding this surprise by-election prompted by the fact that he has chosen to resign and then stand again in what he has called a people versus the establishment. And essentially, it's a way to sort of try and circumvent all this financial scrutiny that he has faced over gifts in recent weeks. That scrutiny has been mounting, and he is also facing a probe by the parliamentary commission as well. And so essentially this sort of forced by-election was intended to kind of allow, in his words, the people to make their decision on his behaviour. But what has happened is that all the establishment parties have effectively refused to field candidates in this election. The only candidate that is standing, and this is one of the sort of joys and vagaries of British political life, is this novelty candidate called Count Binface. And effectively the strategy here by the establishment parties is to sort of take the wind out of any victory from Nigel Farage. It's harder for him to argue that he has won a vote against the establishment if the establishment refuses to field candidates. But effectively what that's also done is means that this kind of perhaps impetus, this sort of anyone but Farage contingents of voters that may be choosing to vote in this Clacton by-election may then turn their attention to Count Binface, who might see this sort of potential surge in protest votes. And it's worth noting that Binface, in one guise or another, has basically been standing in high-profile elections since 2017. He tends not to really get anything beyond just a sort of token vote. So it's really interesting to see that. And then the other context as part of what's going on in the UK right now is that this by-election, although we don't yet have a firm date, is going to offer perhaps a sort of split-screen effect, because at the same time as all of this drama is going on with Farage, effectively drawing attention away from what's happening in the Labour Party, which is Andy Burnham effectively being coronated, expected to become Prime Minister on July 17th. That effective sort of what Labour will be hoping is a smooth transition of power from Keir Starmer to Burnham. But there will be potentially an enormous amount of distraction from Farage and whatever is going on with the by-election there, although we are still waiting for that kind of final date of confirmation.
And Rebecca, we've seen Reform UK face pressure from further rights groups. Is there a bigger trend here when it comes to support for right-leaning parties?
I think that's right. And even in the UK, when we think about it, we also have parties on the far right appearing alternatives to reform. You think about Restore Britain. But in this part of the world, we have seen that come up in the form of Pauline Hanson. Now, notably, just recently, her party, One Nation, has seen exceeding the popularity of other establishment parties in the polls for the first time ever. Now, interestingly, when we think about One Nation, I mean, Pauline Hanson is not a new figure when it comes to thinking about far right and right politics in Australia. She's been around for at least sort of 3 decades or so. And it's worth noting that actually her politics and her policies haven't changed much. What has changed is the context in which she's operating. Some of her policies effectively have become much more popular. And I think that is a shift that we are seeing much more widely. It echoes this shift towards the right, more populist parties in Eastern Europe, for example. Of course, we have that example of the UK too, and everything that Farage represents. And French courts recently clearing the way for Marine Le Pen potentially to stand in an election there. So this is still something that is, as you say, very much a global shift. Though worth pointing out, in some parts of Eastern Europe, you look at Poland, we have seen that shift back to a more moderate, sort of pro-European consensus via an election there. So it is certainly the momentum that we are seeing globally, but there are pockets where things are happening slightly differently, or there is a shift back to a somewhat more central moderate stance.
Economics and government reporter Rebecca Chung-Wilkins, thank you for that. Our next guest is a renowned political and campaign strategist. He's been a leading advisor for conservative parties in Australia, the UK and Canada. Sir Lynton Crosby is co-founder and executive chairman of CT Group, an international consultancy. He is with us for a very rare interview. Good to have you with us, Lynton. I mean, why is the right gaining ground? Is there a crisis of confidence? Is it ideological fatigue? What's going on here?
I think it's more populism is rising. Yes, a lot of it's from the right, but it's not only from the right. In relation to the UK, for example, the left, the extreme left, have increased their support. The recent council elections showed that the Greens, who had gone very much to the left under their new leader, did very well as well, much better than they normally do. But there's no doubt that people are feeling the system's not working for them. There's a high degree of economic anxiety. They've lost trust in traditional political parties, in the media, in big business as well, and they're looking for something different. Partly it's a cry for attention to the issues that are important for them, but very much it's about the system's not working. We've tried the mainstream. Let's give something else a go.
So centrism right now dead?
No, look, I think centralism is not dead, as was just mentioned. You know, in some parts of Europe, when you focus on the issues, when you can demonstrate that you've got an economic plan, that you've got answers to the challenges that people face, then you can build support. I think I wouldn't dismiss it as a passing phase. I don't think anyone should be as arrogant as that. But it is, in a sense, a cry for help from voters that their issues are not getting the attention they want. In Australia, where Pauline Hanson has hit the lead in the polls, and she's been around for 30 years, what we've found is that the level of pessimism about the direction of the country is the highest we've seen. So it's a reaction to that sense of pessimism. The challenge for parties like One Nation in Australia and Reform in the United Kingdom is to demonstrate that they've got answers, not just slogans, and that not just performative politics, that they actually can not only articulate, and they do articulate well, people's concerns, but that they can provide credible, long-term, feasible solutions to the problems the nations are confronting.
So for parties and for leaders right now, how do they capitalize on that? When you take a look at your campaigns, they've always leaned on risk and fear. Is that still the way to go? Or is there a need to kind of do a pivot?
Well, the thing about an election is voters have to make a choice. They're looking at different candidates. They have to make a choice between those candidates. So when you're running an election campaign, you're trying to position your candidate as having answers to the problems the country faces, but it's entirely legitimate also to point to the other side and what the risk that they might be, the lack of answers that they have, or the way their policy agenda will not take the country forward but could set it back.
Let's take a look at what's coming up in 4 months, the midterms. the stage is set given the backdrop of the Iran war that is still ongoing and lots of questions about whether or not we'll see any kind of resolution. How might that play out for President Trump?
Well, as you say, 4 months to go, and 4 months is an exceptionally long time in politics today because there is so much uncertainty. So many things are changing on a regular basis. We thought we had peace in the Middle East, now it's a question mark again. So the voters themselves are confused. On the one hand, they want a focus on their issues. In the United States, again, there's economic anxiety. How does it play out? Concerns about fuel prices. Traditionally, it's been accepted that you could map political support by the movement in gasoline prices in the United States. More recently, that seems to have changed under Donald Trump. So the acceptance that, well, if gasoline prices go up, the president's support goes, or the party's support goes down, that seems to have been broken. And I think that's one of the things we're grappling with politics today. The traditional norms, the accepted sort of patterns of behaviour are completely disrupted. So one would expect if Iran drags on, if there is that impact on energy prices and therefore on the economy, that voters would react against that, and that should be beneficial to the Democrats in the midterm elections. But then people look at the Democrats and they're not sure what they see because they see the Democrats themselves divided as a party. So it introduces a much greater degree of complexity and uncertainty at a time that actually voters are looking for more stability, certainty and direction.
And happening at a time when we're seeing the messaging oscillating between de-escalation and, an escalation at the same time. I'm just wondering, what is the psyche of the people right now? I mean, do they rally around the flag, and what indications are there to show that they're not?
One of the most important drivers of political decision-making for voters is personal relevance. What does whatever is happening mean for me? And in this environment, people are worried about their economic circumstances. They're worried about the direction of their country. They believe that one of the basic sort of precepts of life in America or Australia or the United Kingdom or in many countries was you work hard, you play by the rules, you get a decent education, you try to give your children a decent education, and you can have a better life in terms of better standard of living, a home of your own, whatever it might be. People feel that's been broken. So in looking at all of these events, they say, how does this affect those ambitions for me in my life? What is this going to do? Is this making my life easier? Is this relevant to me? If they think these foreign interventions are undermining their life, are undermining the view they have of their country, that can be a negative. On the other hand, if they believe it's necessary to stabilise the world or deal with something that's a country that's a threat to stability in the world, they could rationalise that it's a price worth paying, as long as it's only in the short term and as long as it's part of a plan. People want stability and confidence in from their politicians, and so they want to know that there's a plan in place. If it's just who knows what's going on and it's all a bit of a sort of a excursion that people can't rationalise and understand, then it can be problematic.
You talk about stability. There's no stability right now. If you were running Trump's campaign in the next 4 months, what would you do? What would your advice be for President Trump?
Focus on the economy. At the end of the day, countries are political economies. And the economy, the state of the economy, provides the foundation for people's ability to get ahead in life. If the economy is undermined, if the economy is weakened, if people think you're focusing on things beyond the economy, then that's a political price that's not worth paying. So in every country, in every election, my sort of first port of call is always to demonstrate that you've got a plan for the economy that means that you can have a stronger and growing economy. Because if you look at countries around the world, whether you're concerned about health, education or your own economic well-being, Only countries that have strong economies can deliver the health services you want, the transport systems that you want, the education system that you want. So I'd really want to make sure that my campaign was anchored in a focus on the economy, and particularly if it's a Conservative government, because in terms of left versus right, and take the UK as an example, the Labor Party is always going to make promises to spend more on health and education and those things. But people look to Conservatives to provide the economic foundations that ensure the country can be successful and people in turn can be successful.
President Trump might just argue that his geopolitical moves are for the economy. It was to bring oil prices down. And if you take a look at how the markets are doing, they're at record highs.
Yeah,
so his economy is intact.
It's a risk. It's a risk for him, this continued international foray. He would be hoping that he can get it behind him. That's why I think there's a great sense of frustration in his language when the issue sort of rises up again, because you'd be hoping you could put it behind you and get on with a focus on domestic issues, which tend to be the most personally relevant. Not always, but at this time, people are really interested in the state of the country, the state of their life, the opportunities for themselves and their children.
There is chaos everywhere, including in the UK. What do you make of that political chaos there? It's much worse than Italy before.
Yeah, well, it's a new. Italy always used to be the joke in Europe of having more leaders than any other country. Now the United Kingdom is heading for 7 prime ministers in 10 years, and there is. I've never seen it. I've been in and out of the United Kingdom for over 20 years now in terms of politics. I've never seen the lack of confidence that people have. Just as I mentioned, in Australia, people think the country is heading in the wrong direction. Very much in the UK, they think the country is heading in the wrong direction as well. And they're frustrated. They feel that that they can't control things too. That's another dimension, the lack of sort of sense of personal empowerment. Everybody else seems to be either winning or controlling things, and here I am trying to get on with my life, and things are out of control.
We're talking about Burnham's possible coronation, and I'm just wondering how big the challenges are for him.
I think, and this is probably not a widely held view, but I think Keir Starmer could have won the next election.
How?
By just continuing to govern and to get people focused on the economy and on issues that were important to the British people. I think one of the big changes in the last 20 years in politics is the number of opinion polls that come out almost every day. And in the United Kingdom, there's been something like 350 opinion polls since the start of the year. And you have members of Parliament, members of the public, members of the media look at these opinion polls and they're sort of jumping in response. Oh, we're behind in the polls, we better do something, rather than taking a more steady long-term view. So now they've opted for a new Prime Minister, basically because they thought, we're behind in the polls, we've been consistently behind in the polls. Now, one thing about that message is it's all about them. It's about their position. We're behind in the polls, we think we're going to lose, rather than thinking about the voters, the people, the country, and what do we need to do to take the country forward, to provide the stability, direction and economic growth that everybody wants in order to have a better life. So I think they've made a mistake to change the leader. I think they've jumped. You saw the Conservatives move from Boris Johnson to Liz Truss, and then within a matter of 40-odd days to Rishi Sunak. It's this sort of almost panicked response to opinion polls, rather than sitting back and taking a more careful and considered look at what's going on and what's needed to address it. It's not enough to change the leader and think it might all change. It may, but it's highly unlikely.
Lynton, I'm taking you on a trip around the world. We're going off to Melbourne next, where we're seeing Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi being given a ceremonial welcome by his counterpart in Australia. Modi receiving that ceremonial welcome in Melbourne. I'm just wondering, what's your take on relations between India and Australia, and how much is at stake here?
Well, firstly, a lot of people don't understand the strength of the Indian diaspora in Australia now. Many have understood that there's been a big Chinese diaspora in Australia, but actually the Indian diaspora is equal or greater in terms of numbers now. And so India, in terms of relationships, family relationships, is very important, and defence and security relationships as well. Because, of course, in recent years we've had the Quad, which brings India into the mix with Australia, Japan and the United States. So there's relationships culturally because of the strength of the Indian population within Australia. There's the opportunity that India provides as the other super large population and economic opportunity for Australia as a trading nation. We've seen in recent years when there were hiccups between the relationships in the relationship between Australia and China that Australia suffered for a period, and so having another option, and that's one of the big changes in the world today is with global power superpower competition. You need options. You need to find alternatives. You can't rely on any one as your main source of income or relationship. So that's very important as well. And so I think that for Australia, both from a defence and national security perspective and from an economic perspective, that it's a very important and growing relationship. And Modi is something of a master of strategic pragmatism, so because he's building relations with countries in a way that India hasn't always in the past.
Can India really be a counter to China?
Well, I don't think you should look at it simply in those terms, but from an economic optionality viewpoint, it's a very large market. There is a lot of outward Indian investment that's available. We've seen some big Indian players operating in Australia already. And in terms of internal or external for Australia into India, there's a huge market there. So it's a good alternative when you want optionality to look at a country like India. From a defence perspective, India does not have an expansionary defence posture, but it's an important player in the region, in Indian Ocean, and so it's important for Australia to build that relationship.
What concrete steps do you think can be taken to deepen that strategic relationship between the two? What would you like to see coming out of Modi's visit in Australia?
Well, I think there's a number of things that can be explored. Firstly, mineral resources, strengthening mining investment from India into Australia. Conversely, Australian export opportunities into India. Further strengthening defence ties and relationships, and particularly directly between Australia and India. There's been a growth in manoeuvres and exercises between the two countries, and that should continue. And I think given the prominence of the Indian population in Australia, it's important for stability and social cohesion that there is an understanding between the countries and a strengthened relationship between the countries too.
You talked about shifting alliances, which are necessary given the uncertainty with the US, with China. Do you see the middle powers bending together even more? And how successful do you think they can be in navigating the current environment?
I don't think I don't think that the middle powers sort of coming together as a group is a sustainable and enduring proposition. I remember the speech by Carney at Davos, I think it was, where he talked about, we the middle powers, we've been operating in a slightly false world. Some of the institutions we said didn't really work, but we all turned a blind eye to that fact. I think that the key thing is for any country, particularly middle powers, to build relationships with a whole series of other countries, including, the global powers as well, but not selling their soul to any one group or any one country.
Isn't it just a matter of the world coming to terms with a China that's emerging? Is that the issue right now that's in the way of US-China relations and spilling over to the rest of the world?
I think China's part of the equation, obviously, and it is. I think it's emerged. Frankly, it's it's prominent throughout the world. It's taken positions in Africa, for example, and through the Pacific and beyond. But it's also the changing nature of the United States and the policy agenda of the current president and how people view the reliability of the United States in terms of international relations or as a trading partner. And the dominant, there's always been within the United States, obviously, a focus on America's own interests, but there's a sense by many countries that this has become a much more transactional environment, and as a result, countries need to look at how they deal with the United States, how they deal with China, how they avoid getting squeezed in the middle, which you see in the technology and the AI debate as a real challenge for countries. So you've got to be driven by your own national interest.
You talk about countries. How about companies? How should they be navigating such an environment? We've seen how in the U.S., tech companies in particular have been bending over backwards to be in line with President Trump's policies.
Yes. Well, there's been, I think one of the big changes of the last decade is the tech bros who had a particular generally held political persuasion have moved in all sorts of directions, and understandably so if they're driven by their own commercial interests, as they should be as private enterprise organisations. Companies need to ensure that they give themselves optionality, just as countries need to give themselves optionality. They need, one of the risks for companies today is activism. Global activism, globally coordinated activism is a real challenge for companies operating domestically within countries like the United States or Australia, but also globally as well. So companies have to be much more attuned to geopolitical affairs in a way that they weren't, I think, a decade or more ago.
Lynton, great perspective. Thank you for popping by. Lynton Crosby, co-founder and executive chairman of CT Group. Before we go, Bloomberg's new series Emerging is launching later today. It explores the many forces reshaping the world's fastest rising economies, from geopolitics to AI. Reneka Doshi and I will lead insightful conversations on the risks and opportunities. Watch on YouTube or listen on Bloomberg Podcast, Apple Podcast, and Spotify. This is Bloomberg.